Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the weekly live stream for the Restitutor Orbis channel. And I'm your host, Lucius Aurelian. And after going into a couple topics on reset, I thought I would just go ahead and deep dive into reset survival. About a year ago, I did a series of explorations on reset compounds and the other forms they may have taken, whether we're talking about monasteries or asylums or any sort of compound that was purposed potentially to survive a reset. And the reason I wanted to dive into this is it is a legitimate question. How do you survive a reset? Why would you want to, someone may ask. And other people would say it's not possible to survive a reset. I've heard it all. We're actually going to talk about, though, what we mean when we talk about surviving a reset. And I'd like to extend a welcome to all Prime Explorers, viewers, and all others joining us. And by all means, light up that chat and thank you for joining us. And please hit that like button. What you're looking at right here, though, is the old histomap of world history. Now, again, I covered this about a year ago. This very incredible document that they have that shows the rise and fall of peoples and nations for 4,000 years, and it's all on a single document. Now, of course, this goes on, all the way to the present date, and you see anywhere from about 5 to 6 major nations, empires, civilizations, whatever you want to call them. I mean, here you see Aegeans, Egyptians, the Hittites, Iranians, Indians, Huns, Chinese, others. And what they'll do is you follow this document down and it shows you their rise, their fall, and significant events over time. Now, when you go lower on this chart, there's a time when Rome takes up about, 4/5 of it. Not really surprising. Why am I showing the histomap? Because it's one of those documents to give you a confident idea that we know exactly how our history unfolded. On the other hand, one of the questions I asked when I first saw this as a professor is, how many things are we overlooking in this document? How many peoples? How many cultures? What about the people that built Petra, those nomads, those wonderful carving nomads? Why aren't they on this document anywhere? I remember asking that, and then lo and behold, they showed up on the document the following year when they revised it. Fine, fair enough. Everybody makes mistakes. But the whole point behind this is we don't know. It's actually a giant hand wave. And really, this document is a giant hand wave. Now, whatever your thoughts are on our history, whether it's completely accurate, and I do concede, yes, this document may be 98% accurate. Of course, it might not even be 8% accurate or 0.08% accurate. The point being is that we have documents like this, and they show us exactly how things happen. The other thing you'll find in history is the concept of cycles. And we love to talk about empires and kingdoms, and we talk about how empires rise and they fall over time. They have their ascendancy, and then they have their collapse. And I do think that's something that history does get right. There does seem to be a lot of steps within that. Although, are these actual autonomous civilizations, or are they something else? For another time. But we look at this, and this is probably one of the most basic ways that they show the rise and decline of an empire. The age of pioneers, age of conquest, age of commerce, age of affluence, age of intellect, and then the age of decline and collapse. 6, not 5. My goodness. Whoa, not 5? Crazy, you say. But what's intriguing about it, though, is that everything is cyclical. Now, one of the first things I want to address in this, as we deep dive into this exploration, is I do not know what the cycles are. I am not read in on some big secret plan. I don't know what the overall plan is or the events of the past, present, or future. I'm as much in the dark as all of you are, or perhaps I'm as much in the fog is a better way to say it. So I just want to make the disclaimer that I am not going to claim that I know when the next reset or major calamity or catastrophe or end of the world, remember there's many different ways to refer to it, although they all seem to mean the same thing. I don't know when it's going to happen. Now, there's plenty of other people who claim they know when it's going to happen, and they claim they have the evidence, and maybe they do. And I'm not here tonight to denigrate or to question anybody, although we are going to look at a couple quote unquote historical examples of people who did take this knowledge and do some, well, perhaps we should say, questionable things with it. Because if you think about it, resets, the end of the world, it has a very powerful, profound psychological impact on people. And you could also say if you really want to influence people or control people, and of course I'm using the official governmental terminology here, then fear is a great way to do it, and theatricality and deception. And as I like to say, go back and watch the nuclear nightmare fear films from the early 80s, And tell me, did any of those films provide a solution? What can you really do about nuclear war? The answer? Absolutely nothing. And thus is life. So, what are you going to do about it? Anyways, these are some interesting paintings by Thomas Coleman, an artist from the 1800s. And I'm showing them right now because it's intriguing to think of that there were artists who captured this whole concept of this rise and fall of civilizations. So it appears that this has always been known and it's always been unknown. So, going underground. Yes, it's a good point there, Albie. And it's a good way to think about these things. What I find fascinating about this, though, is that artists were thinking about the destruction and the fall of the land. Now, some people say they're merely depicting the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. You know, there was that book that was written about it, and everybody talked about it. All historians know about it. Of course, the one thing you won't hear historians talk about is how many times we've had to rediscover the very existence of the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic. It's rather intriguing. We lost the works of Tacitus and then we found them. Oh, another interesting thing when you look at this painting, look at the arrangement of the blocks here. Where have we seen this pattern before? Someone was clearly paying attention, and it's used even in star forts to this day in places like Alabama, you'll see it. But you get this impression of this terrifying destruction. What was the source of this terrifying destruction? Was it divine destruction? Was it a civilization destroying itself? Was it destroyed by other civilizations? Was it a vast change in their ecology, their environment, things that were beyond their control? Or was it all the above? Well, when you look at a painting like this, you get the impression that it was all the above. Disasters that they couldn't control, the civilization falling apart, and people tearing each other apart, and all the worst nightmares. And again, the same things that you would see reflected in those nuclear nightmare fear films from the early 1980s. And let's not forget the war game from the 1960s. The BBC, they always had the monopoly on the best nuclear fear films, didn't they? Now, looking at some of these other paintings, though, you can see that they did try to capture the cycle. Now, who knows if this Thomas Cole really existed or not? We're informed that he did, but you know, the early 1800s was a long time ago. Could these works have been done by somebody else? Possibly. But it's what they really show that interests me. This continuous cycle of the rise and the fall of civilizations and what's really responsible for it. And there's a lot of people who get very emotionally involved and attached to these theories and these timelines that they have. And so let's go to our first part here. Beware of false prophets and the fallout warning. So give me one moment here and we're going to transition images to our false prophets. Now, as I said, I'm talking about historical examples here, so don't get so concerned. I know people think they know the truth, and we'll talk about someone who thought they knew the truth. This is William Miller, and he was merely a preacher in the 1840s in the United States, and his followers were called the Millerites. Miller had done his own analysis of the Bible and prophecy, and he even had the evidence to back it up. And by his own research, he had figured out that the world was going to end in 1844. Now I know what you're saying. Hey, wait a minute. You just said that the 1800s are a very questionable time. Absolutely right. Who knows what the reality behind this William Miller is? It's very peculiar to me, though, that we have this event that's very well documented. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, he convinced a lot of people, we don't really know how many people, that the world was going to end in 1844 and had a very specific date for it. Well, when the date came and went, it was called the Great Disappointment. But apparently his movement didn't die, and it evolved into what is today called the Seventh-day Adventists. Now, again, I'm not poking fun at any beliefs or anything like that, merely relating what is recorded as a historical event. But it is safe to say that, according to the history and even to the own theology, that the prediction was incorrect. It was a disappointment. But did this really happen in the 1840s, or didn't it? That's the question for us all to consider. But apparently he had the documentation, he had the evidence, and a lot of people accepted that evidence. And ultimately, it's up to you. Maybe if we were around back at that time, this evidence would convince us that, yes, 1844, that's going to be the end of it. The numbers all add up. Look, you see, the numbers will show you it's 1844. That's going to be the end of the world, or that's going to be the reset. But it didn't happen. And many people were left in very dire personal financial situations, or quite frankly, ruined for the rest of their lives as a result of this. So thoughts on this? They were disappointed the world didn't end. Well, Saxon Ranger, that's a good question. They were disappointed that their prophecy was incorrect. I mean, if you think about this, everybody was all bought in on this, and they had been saying that we support this theory. We support William Miller's theory. Now, again, did this really happen as we're told, or is this alluding to something else that I don't know? So, but anyways, it's kind of intriguing to me, though, how there are a lot of people who seem to believe that they are absolutely correct about this. And maybe they are. I guess we'll just have to see what happens. So they were just disappointed that the prophecy didn't come to fruition. Anyways, you can find a lot of documentation on this, which is why I question it, because why would there be so much documentation on this end of the world that didn't happen event? It's very, very peculiar. It's another one of those things that I openly question. But going to a more recent example, we constantly have our good friend here, Nostradamus, whose prophecies are, well, dare I say, brought back. I remember in the 1990s, they were talking about the prophecies of Nostradamus. There's going to be a great war in the Middle East, and the powers in the East and the West are going to fight as allies. Of course, if you looked at the prophecies from the 1970s, they didn't say anything like that because, that's when the Cold War was still going on. But then the 1990s came along, and suddenly the great quatrains of Nostradamus were revised and reprogrammed, and so on and so forth. Now, on that note, this is Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Elizabeth Clare Prophet was featured on the In Search of episode The Man Who Wouldn't Die. She is the founder of the Church of the Universal and Triumphant. And when she was featured on that episode, most of the people in the church were big believers in the concept of the flame of freedom in Saint Germain. You can watch it. It's a very interesting episode hosted by Leonard Nimoy, The Man Who Wouldn't Die. That's the name of the episode. But in the late 1980s, very early 1990s, she had a prediction for her church and the people who believed in her theory, and that was there's going to be a nuclear war. And if memory serves, the specific date was early March 1990. I might be off on that. I'm shooting from the hip. The exact date, it's not relevant, but this did happen, and I do remember this being in the news. And all of her followers went to Montana, and they began building all of these very incredible fallout shelters in this survival compound. They were going to be prepared. Well, guess what? The day came and then it went. And Elizabeth Clare Prophet had evidence, much like Miller did, and she was very convincing. And if you've ever seen the footage of her speaking, she is very articulate and she's very charismatic. There's no denying that. And at the end of the day, though, all these followers, all these people, many of them had sold out their entire life savings, their homes, they had quit their jobs because they thought this nuclear war was going to happen. And this nuclear war didn't happen. And this was called yet another great disappointment. In fact, when they came out of their shelters and they saw that, no, there were no nuclear bombs in the horizon like there were in that one video game, I forget which one it was, but no, I'm not talking about Fallout yet. But they saw that there was no conflict and it was considered another great disappointment. So about a third of the followers took off and the rest stayed. And she said that, well, it must be because we prayed and we managed to alter the result. Or as the good father from the film Dead Alive said, this called for divine intervention. And I guess they got divine intervention. So again, I'm not poking fun at anybody's beliefs here. Just that's what is stated to have happened. They had a prediction. It didn't happen. People were disappointed. So then, well, we prayed and we altered the result. And therefore, the world didn't end. The reset didn't happen. Maybe so. Can't disprove it. Oh yeah, Father Magruder. That was the name of this character. You should really watch this film. It's also called Brain Dead, an early Peter Jackson film from the early 1990s. Now, back to the concept of Nostradamus on this interesting... what do we got here? Yeah, they were wrong. The real mothership is being Apophis. Yeah, I mean, and it's one of those things when you can see hindsight is 2020. But the interesting thing is how our minds operate and how a lot of us do want to have something to believe in, and we all feel that way. What's Adam Bomb say here? Nuclear war equals boogeyman, has been and always will be. Mutually assured destruction. Yeah, again, it's kind of interesting that statistician I remember from school, Brother Adam, who left his job after he calculated the odds of a nuclear war not happening from 1949 to 1989. Yes. Anyways. So back to Nostradamus, you can find these documentaries that they did in the early 90s. They're still available on YouTube, many of them. And you can see what they said about the predictions of Nostradamus then, and you can see what they're saying about the predictions of Nostradamus now. Yes, we're interpreting those quatrains a little differently here in 2023, 24, and now 25. What's going to happen in 2026? Well, we've got some evidence there's going to be some terrible things happening. Or, it's kind of like watching any major newscast these days. The only thing that's good is this one good news story about one individual, but the events of society and civilization, well, it's just going to get worse. It's going to get worse, Kathy, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, for the final concept of the warning, I go to the video game series Fallout. Now, yes, I'm well aware there's a TV show that's based on it, but I started with the video game series, and that's where this idea was. Fallout was a classic point-and-click adventure game from the late 1990s, and it was based and inspired by Mad Max. And yes, we will be talking a little bit about Mad Max because there is something pertinent in it for our purposes. But anyway, in this game series, it was set in the mid-2000s, 2050 to 2070. And by 2070, there was an all-out nuclear exchange between China and the United States after resources dwindled. It had a rather unique aesthetic to it because if you're not familiar with it, the game was sort of set in a futuristic world or a retro-futuristic world with kind of the cool 1950s Art Deco style. Very, very intriguing. But one of the points behind it was the people knew this war was coming. The government knew this war was coming, so they were going to build vaults. The vaults for the people to go into, and they would survive this nuclear catastrophe. And here you can see one of the layouts of one of these vaults, and they advertised this for people. This is how you could survive, and you had to reach the vault. And that was the eponymous vault of the game. And where the known vaults were, well, you can see that they're all across the land. No real vaults plotted in the Midwest, but that's not to say that they weren't there. But for those of you who are familiar with the game, what was really going on with the vaults? Were the vaults actually there to save the people, or did they have a much more insidious purpose behind them? Thoughts on that? Second verse, same as the first. I'm Henry VIII, I am, says Vaughn. Yeah, true enough. Well, what you found out was that these vaults were not there to save the people. They were just there for the corrupted government in this fictional universe because, we know our government would never do anything like this. And what they did was these people were to be sent to these vaults to have scientific experiments done on them. Some vaults were control groups. They didn't do anything to them. They just left them in the vault. The war ended and they were released afterwards. Other people had terrifying biological experiments that were done on them. Others had social experiments done on them. For example, one of the vaults had all men and just one woman, and other such variations, testing how they could change societies and cultures. Apparently, this corrupted government of this fictional United States thought that they could study their own people and figure out ways that they could survive. Although their Hail Mary plan or play to save themselves and their government was to build a spaceship and go to a planet that hadn't been discovered, at least according to the lore of the series. But in any event, you think about this. All these people thinking that they were going to this vault to be saved, and it wasn't necessarily the case. Yes, you may have been lucky. You might have been to one of the control vaults where they didn't actually do experiments, but most of them did experiments. And a lot of the experiments were rather terrifying. And this is one of the most known images where you actually see the vault door with the number of the vault on it. And based on the number of the vault, you could look up which particular experiments they were committing. Now, of course, only the company and the US government knew which vaults were control vaults where no experiments were happening and which ones were they tinkering with the population. But it's a very disturbing premise. And you think about all these horrifying things that they did to these people. And you think about what's the greatest warning that if you have to fall under a authoritarian regime, or if that concept of believing someone is actually going to pull you into something and save you, when in fact it does not. In fact, it's really the end of everything for you. And that's always the danger we have to look at. There's an even more disturbing possibility that I looked at, that what if in the distant past, the reality was there was no reset? The people were simply tricked to go into these shelters, and then terrifying things were done to them, to include just simple eradication. That's a very distinct possibility we have to face. And I think that's why we have to remember that this profound idea of how powerful this concept of reset, the end of the world, or destruction is on people. It's how you can really influence people by saying, yes, I've done some research, and yes, I can tell you exactly when the world's going to end. I'm going to let you in on a little something. If there is anybody out there that knows exactly when the next reset's going to happen or when the world's going to end, that information would never, ever be shared. It would not even be spoken of. Now, if you really want to believe that it is, and if you want to believe that someone's done the research and they can tell you, I'm not going to stop you. But I'm just going to let you know, how would that benefit anybody to let anybody else know when it's going to happen? Now, if somebody had control over it, then what could they do? Well, it's not actually going to happen in 2050. We'll just have it happen in 3 years. Catch everybody unprepared, thinking that they have plenty of time to prepare. There's all kinds of crazy possibilities you can do. But like I said, I'm not here to denigrate anybody. I'm not here to insult anybody. Believe what you will and decide what's real and what's not. Ultimately, that's on you. I'm not here to do that. Now, let's move on to the next part. Evidence of survival of previous resets. You're going to ask, okay, so where is this evidence that you have? How do you think or know that there were previous resets that people may have survived? Well, believe it or not, we do have some very convincing evidence. Now, whether you accept it as evidence or not, again, I leave that up to you, because a lot of people will say it's not really evidence because, I say so. Well, fair enough. If you don't want to assess it as evidence, that's on you. But you can go all over the land and you will find these very unique monasteries all over the place. Now, we're not talking about the asylums right now. We're just simply talking about the monasteries. Monasteries have always interested me because they're not just isolated and beautiful locations as they tend to be. It's also the fact that there's a lot of things that are attributed to monasteries. The very survival of civilizations, the very survival of knowledge is attributed to monasteries. And I suspect that there's some truth to that. I suspect that there might be some reality behind this. Now, if you look at some of these monasteries, you'll find that they share some traits. Now, granted, some monasteries are close to urban areas, and that does make sense, but a lot of them are very isolated, very exotic, hard to reach locations. And you think about this. You think about the difficulty it would have taken at any point in time. And of course, we're informed these monasteries were done anytime from 500 to 1,000 years ago. It depends on the monastery, but done well before this current age of high technology, and in most cases done before the almighty Industrial Revolution, which you'll see there's many commenters, they'll attribute that to the construction of these buildings. But somehow somebody did these incredible monasteries with some of the more detailed constructions on them in remote areas without an Industrial Revolution. Oh, but they did build some stairs up to it. And wait, I've got a real doozy for you later. So what do these monasteries really show us? Well, they give us the impression that in some of these exotic locations, that this was some sort of deliberate plan, that perhaps at the time, this was their plan to survive the reset, that these are the last remaining bastions of the reset outposts from possibly the last reset. And there's even some of these that appear to have been built on the remnants of previous structures, maybe even from previous resets, for all we know. And I know that's a stretch because the reality is things get very problematic, even in theory and speculation, to get an idea of what the heck happened even before the fourth era, or the era that preceded ours, the previous civilization. Because all we have is just a lot of broken down myth and a lot of legends, which probably has a lot of reality to it, but it becomes more difficult to reconstruct the exact details of the story. Now, some people say that they can and they trust what they're reading, and maybe you can, maybe it's correct, but I suspect that a lot of it is not, that it's all part of obfuscating the official account, so we don't really have any idea. We know something happened, or again, it's possible that, sure, there were groups of very pious and religious people, and keep in mind these monasteries were built from people of every religion all across the land. They decided to embark upon the most difficult endeavor they possibly could to show their aesthetic and ascetic, yes, I'm using both words there, appreciation of the Almighty, depending on what their concept of the Almighty was, whether we're talking Buddha, God, Yoga, it doesn't matter. The whole concept being that we're to believe that this was all the result of piety. Maybe so. Maybe so. Maybe it really is that powerful. But what are your thoughts on these actually being reset compounds? Heidi, hip shooting, not good aim. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it, isn't it? uh, Lane, 500,000 at 500 to 1,000 years ago. We may never actually know. And a great point. We may never actually know because are we to trust our scientific deductions? Do the instruments that we use for carbon dating are they accurate? Can they give us any idea when these structures were built? Well, we have documents, we have records, but do we? Look into a monastery sometime and see what you can really find out. It's quite intriguing. So, Casey, I'm surprised they don't label them as sacrificial sites. Well, I don't know. Some of them may be. It's interesting when you see what's really attributed to them. Hmm. Chassis, didn't they say you can't actually carbon date? It depends on the date, Chassis. They go back and forth on it. But yeah, if they go back and forth on something, you really have to wonder, don't you? And so you see some of these impressive locations. Ah, yes, Mont Saint Michel in France, the one that always floods. But yeah, they decided to build a very impressive monastery. And again, this is another wonder from before the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, we can't say that, yeah, we had the Industrial Revolution. That's how we explain this incredible location. If you have the means, or if you are residing in or anywhere around Europe and you can easily access this location, I strongly advise you to do so. If you want to see some very perplexing and puzzling things, this is an incredible location to explore, both from the exterior and the interior. And just really think about it. Really think about what you see and try to reconcile that with what we're given in terms of the historical account with the construction of this abbey that's in France. Yeah, right off the channel. It's a very impressive structure. And again, ask yourself that question. Even with modern implementations of technology and everything else we have, we couldn't build it. Yeah, I know. We've got safety standards, we've got unions, and we just don't have the money like we did in the past. We just don't have the money. We've got trillions of dollars of debt, but we don't have the money to build structures like this. And maybe you can accept that. This has always been one of my favorites, though, because I do suspect that this is one of those locations that's always had a prominence to it, that likely this is something that's been with us through multiple eras. Again, I could be wrong. What are your thoughts on that? Hmm. Philip, looks like an unmelted mountain. Yeah, and that's what you tend to get a lot of, too. Philippi, sorry about that. But yeah, absolutely right. Not sure. It's best to avoid carbon dated beverages. Yeah, true enough. Fred Silvers, investigate what's in line with those structures. You can do that too. And there are a lot of things that are geographically in line with them. There may even be a means that a lot of these locations are in line with each other in ways that we can't exactly perceive. But more to follow on that later. Now, looking at some other ones, Mont Saint Michel, you do find some very isolated locations, with one of these old churches. Now, here you have this exact same thing. Is this just the foundation rock? Is this part of the hill or the mountain or the ridgeline? Or is it something else? Obviously, this is a wall that's artificially constructed. But what about below it? And that's where the line really starts to get blurred. And that's another reason why monasteries are so intriguing to me, especially for on site explorations. Because it may be these are the locations where you could really experience multiple eras, that perhaps the locations, for whatever reason, were significant in previous eras, maybe for reasons we don't understand. And that's why they had to be preserved, and that's why you have this incredible construction. Now, thinking that perhaps this could have once been a larger structure, well, people will tell you that you're out of your mind. It's not possible. It's natural. It may be natural. Or maybe there's something else that's significant with a location. I'm always fascinated, though, by the fact that we have these incredible churches, these cathedrals, or these basilicas, all the above, or mosques, or whatever, any kind of holy building, that always seem to be built in these prominent locations. And the explanation will be, well, they wanted to get closer to the sky and be closer to God. Yes, the same reason as to why the cemeteries are always built on the hill in the most inconvenient places. Again, maybe so. I'm not discounting it. But it's very intriguing, though, that these hills that they're built on always have legends and myths associated with them that purportedly go back to the before the original construction of the building. So thoughts on that? They probably say it's haunted to keep people away. Ah, yes, music holds the secret. That's tends to be what you hear a lot of. It's haunted, it's a terrifying place. You don't really want to go there. And such be life. Now let's look at some more. This is probably one of my favorites here. And I do believe this one's in China. Look at this. Imagine going all the way up there. Don't slip now. They do have some very, very impressive monasteries in China. Now, again, wondering about the rest of this rock formation. It could just be a natural rock formation, but there are some very impressive and very death defying sites, like I'll consider this one in China, where you really have to ask that question. Is it a natural rock formation, or is it possible that there's a little bit something more to it? Has anybody ever been to a location like this? And you can see the stairs that you actually have to take to ascend all the way to the top of it. And that's why I say don't slip. But you're thinking about this, you have all the details. It's very isolated. It's out there in the middle of nowhere. It's a very hard to reach location. Has it always been that way? Or are we looking at potentially a reset compound, a place that was designed to survive the coming reset as someone understood it at the time? What's our real story? The whole mountain was a building. It does seem very possible, doesn't it? And it does give you that perception. Hey, Adam, yeah, it does kind of look like a peace symbol, doesn't it? Maybe it was at some point in time. Maybe it was the progenitor of all peace symbols. So, Kathy, I've only been to the Natural Bridge. Well, it's very similar. Very similar, though, in the layout and what it may represent. Cheetah's cheats. Petrified tree stump, easy to cut into. That'd be a heck of a tree. Going back to the colossal tree theory. And I can't discount that one either. But that tends to be where you see these monasteries. And I saved one of the best for last. Skellig Michael, right off of the coast of Ireland, southwest coast of Ireland. A very impressive site, an island that almost looks like a pyramid or the top of a pyramid that's jutting out of the sea. And here you can see these steps. Now, this is a former monastery. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, as if you need any more prominence as to why you go there. There's a song that the alternative band Clonid did called Skellig, and they sing about this impressive island. Very, very unique place. 40 stairs to nowhere, where the king of the world rested for a while. Ah, yes, referring to the king of the world. And no, not what you might think of as the traditional king of the world. A person who wasn't so great, Dare Doan. We'll be exploring that again soon. But what's interesting is with Skellig Michael here, is that you have this concept. We'll look at some more images in a second. You have this concept of, again, the monastery that's built on top of existing terrain, a mountain that's just an island. It's a very, very unique location. Yes, it was featured in Star Wars, The Force Awakens, and The Last Jedi. And again, I'm going to attribute great compliments to Rian Johnson's filmmaking ability by making this impressive, amazing place seem very boring and dull by comparison. That takes a real filmmaker there. Now, some of these other impressive sites, you do get the hint, though, that there was some older technology there, whether we're in Tibet or the Himalayas. And yes, you'll find some very incredible ones in the Himalayas or Nepal, however you want to pronounce it today. But I mean, look at this. What exactly do we have here? Is this the remnant of some sort of technology, some sort of power generation, or is it just an amazing coincidence? Indeed, when you look past these structures that are clearly built onto the rock, you oddly enough see some other strange patterns in the rock itself. Well, it's just our mind trying to associate patterns that aren't really there. Or is it? What are your thoughts? Yeah, there you go. Picture or pasture a castle. Zing. Maybe so. Lost and found history written giant batteries. That's a strong possibility. Generators for power storage and distribution. Yeah, that could be. Or they could just be giant batteries. Imagine that. You have the ability to power your entire reset compound because you were able to store power there. That's very interesting. Fred, the great trees of old were destroyed by water and fire. Lots of accounts of the great trees of old, no doubt about it. Hey, New West Reset, good to see you, and thanks for joining us. Jamie, Resonator, yes. And again, I'm not wondering if it is some sort of implement of technology that may have always been there, or we don't fully understand it. But you can see it's quite an interesting site. Yes, one of my favorite ones in Spain. And here you can really see the opulence and the detail of the more recent monastery. But then around it, you see this incredible rock formation. It's a rock formation that it was built in and on. Now, it could just be a natural rock formation, but I think this is one of the most dramatic monasteries I've seen just because of how it was constructed and the effort that clearly went into it. The structure right here being one of my favorites. But then also look at all the effort that went into constructing it. Now, if you're really looking to get away from everything, if you're looking to get away from the centers of population, the centers of whatever calamity or catastrophe they were expecting, this might be your location. Are you looking at surviving a plasma fire? Are you looking at surviving a massive flood? Or are you looking at surviving some sort of exchange of weapons that, for all we know, might be much worse than what we think of as nuclear weapons? Who knows for sure? This would be an ideal location. You're far away from everything, you're shielded by the terrain, and you're very well concealed. And you might be surprised to know that this interesting location is not exactly the easiest thing to see from the air. I mean, you can, but it's not exactly the easiest. So it's just an interesting and impressive array of considerations for this particular location. Well, I don't know. No, the monastery is not a ruin. It's still active, apparently. You can go visit the site today, and I strongly recommend it. And it is featured in the monastery's exploration, and I've got some live footage of it and a little bit of aerial camera footage of it. It's quite impressive. So, hey, Luna, good to see you. These are the remains of the building that reached up to the sky. Everything around them has been flooded or melted. And I'm inclined to really agree with that theory, Luna. And that's one of the things for me that really inspired the five eras theory. Because just think if you do have the remnants of a once older colossal building here, or a structure of some sort, whether it was a giant pyramid or who knows, maybe some shape we can't even begin to imagine, a tower that made the Tower of Babel seem like just a small little tower from what we understand. Who knows for sure? But the possibilities are endless. And yet you see other very intriguing constructions like this. Now, if you think about this, I mean, think about how impressive this is. We're not even going to talk about the natural terrain. We've really covered that. Oh, I'm seeing more crazy things with my mind over here. I've got to stop that. My mind is, my imagination's running wild. But we really do clearly have a structure here that appears to be built right into the rock. Even a little tower up here. Now, what are your thoughts on this? Now, granted, this isn't a large structure, but yet imagine someone putting this kind of effort into a smaller structure like this. And again, you will find sites like this all across the land in very isolated places, very dramatic places. And perhaps that's one of the most intriguing elements of the monastery or the abbey or whatever you have that continues with us to this day. Because you're not talking about a large compound here that someone would put a lot of effort into. You're just simply talking about a single structure. So again, it's something that doesn't exactly make sense from the currently understood historical perspective. It's a mystery, and there's not simply an easy answer to it. Robert, used to be one large until bottom melted. Yeah, maybe. And who knows? Were there other structures there and something happened to them? We're not really sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Leave cat nice on 50-mile-per-hour windy days. Yeah, and you think about that, what it has to be built to stand up to. Maybe it was designed to stand up to even more powerful windy days or forces we can't even begin to imagine. Final remnant? Yeah, maybe, Pastor Castles, maybe. Again, something else we just don't know. But then you'll have other structures like this, and everyone thinks of Machu Picchu. For whatever reason, this is kind of giving me some Machu Picchu feelings right here. And you see just how well this structure is laid into the terrain. We always talk about our slanted construction. And just imagine all the effort that would have went into this. And then also think about the logistics it would have taken, especially if we go with the mainstream understood concept of history. I mean, how are you getting water and food up here? Got a bunch of donkeys that are hauling it up there on the trail? I mean, it's not impossible, but it just seems like it's a lot of effort and a lot of, yeah, I know I'm being sarcastic again. All right, just bear with me here. But you think about this. Again, with modern implements of technology in 10 years, could somebody build this? Could somebody build this in 100 years? Even if there was no limit on our very limited monetary resources to this day? I don't know. But again, another one of these very impressive sites. And again, if you can visit any one of these, I strongly recommend it. It doesn't matter which one or where, you'll get a lot of the same observations and details. There's even the good old Milk Abbey in Austria. That's definitely one I recommend. And here's another one of these very unique structures that you can just see on the top of this terrain here. Now, what exactly is this? I say terrain. Is it a rock? Is it some old pillar? Is it some old statue? Is it just an incredible coincidence? I mean, they could all be possible. And yes, this is affiliated with another monastery, interestingly enough. Fred, I'm carrying a grudge for wasting so many years being lied to in school. Well, you think about this. These are the actual sites that we can all go visit in the land that tend to contradict exactly what we've been told. It's just one of those summaries that we have to deal with. It's where we're really looking for the answers here. And people say, what's the purpose of doing the explorations of the old world and trying to believe that there's a civilization that came before us? Well, we know there's a civilization that came before us. We know it. You can't deny it. It just depends how it happened. The 5 W's change: the who, what, where, when, and why. But what's actually been changed? That's what we're trying to figure out. Angelo not just lied to you, but the information is completely omitted. Ah, yes. And that is the information that we're really trying to piece together, Angelo, the information that is completely omitted. Jamie, a petrified Titan's... Yeah, maybe. That's a possibility too. I don't want to discount that, whatever it is. Oh, yeah, here's another perspective of this one. I just like this, how you have this giant tower of rock, all these stairs going up to it, these two structures on the top, and then you have clouds all around it. Kind of makes me think of that Less Than Sufficient 2012 movie where you see the giant wave coming up. But then you look at the rest of the structures here, and you get the idea of what really goes into them. And this is why I'm encouraging you to visit these in person if you have the means. And if not, explore them in other ways, because you'll just get more questions and answers. The incredible construction and the detail that went into even erecting these current structures that are up there. And how difficult was it? Who actually carved out all these stairs? And what were they really getting at with putting these two structures here on the top of this, we'll call it a rock outcropping? Was it once a great beacon or a great tower? Who knows for sure. And then another angle of my favorite one in Spain here. And here you get a better idea for just how impressively detailed this is. Oh, yeah, and why not have a nice little advanced dome on top of it, too? And like I said, if you really want to see more examples of this one, you can go back to the Monasteries exploration. There is some very dramatic aerial footage that lets you see just how impressive this site really is. And again, asking the same questions. Could we do it today? How long would it take? Would it even be possible? And of course, you'll be told no, it won't, for a variety of reasons. And here's a better image of that first one that we looked at. Yes, towers of gold almost. Because, it's cheaper to build in gold than it is to paint in gold. Now, I don't know if it's actually gold, but it is a very impressive look, especially when you see how isolated it is. Again, this is something else that almost seems like it's surreal, but it's very real. You can go visit it, and it does give you that impression. Hey, thanks, New West Reset. I appreciate that, and welcome to the new members. But it does give you that impression, though, that there are many structures out there that defy explanation. And then, of course, there's our classic remote locations where we have these monasteries, and yet they have some very impressive building details in them, just for various reasons. And so maybe whoever built these monasteries, or these reset compounds, as I theorize they were, they knew exactly how to survive a reset. You have to go to a very isolated location. Now, here's a long shot of Skellig Michael. This is the very dramatic site that's in Ireland, or off the southwest coast of Ireland. And you can really see it for all its glory. Now, is it just an island that has a lot of stairs that happen to be carved into it, and also happens to have a monastery on it? I mean, just impressive, especially the time frame that they did this. Why would anybody even think or want to put a monastery out on this very inaccessible island? And when you actually get on the island, you can find evidence of construction that appears much older than we can begin to imagine. When was this erected, or was this just something that was thrown on the top of it to try to distract attention? And there you can see one of the other islands there, but all very, very impressive. And the way it all falls together. Now, again, who really constructed these stairs? Because clearly we have stairs. And what exactly is this? Is this natural? Is it artificial? This is just one of those locations that you can get into, and you're asking those questions all the time. And apparently, Mark Hamill, when they were filming here, almost took a fatal spill down the stairs. Fortunately, he did not. And you can see why. So, who is actually putting all these stairs in there? And what was the purpose behind it? What was the real reason for this very impressive location, Skellig Michael, to exist the way that it did? It's just another one of those things. KC 933. Ireland also has a giant rectangle cut off in a cliff that they call a natural formation. Indeed. And don't forget about Giant's Causeway. Yes, many anomalies in Ireland, KC 933. Don't worry, it's on my list when I get to Europe. I intend to get on the ground there quite extensively. Robert says it, to hide out. Yeah. I mean, if you're really looking to stay out of sight, out of mind, this is the place that you go. Music holds the secret. Tree stump. Yeah. Giant tree stump, maybe. And this is your above shot here, looking at the quote unquote UNESCO World Heritage Site, or the actual monastery that's constructed on it. Now, do you get the idea of a lot of different terrifying forces that were subjected to this rock or this island? Maybe. Is it some sort of strange location anomaly that has a lot of significance to it? Well, they say that the king of the world rested for a while here, Daredone. Who knows for sure? It's just one of those very dramatic areas, though, and it gives you so many clues of what could have been in the past. And is it possible this could have been some sort of reset compound even in previous eras? Absolutely. And so I think when you look at all these sites in totality, you get the idea that yes, these really are the primary evidence that you have that show you that resets occurred in the past. Now, the point you've all been waiting for. We're going to go into the methods of physical, cultural, and spiritual survival. Because even though we don't know when the next reset will happen, it's still safe to say that there may be a calamity, a catastrophe, or a reset that occurs. And what are we going to do about it? How does one actually go about surviving it? Well, let's take a look at some examples, because believe it or not, the idea has been talked about quite extensively. And we'll look at the different perspectives of survival. Now, granted, I'm not any kind of survival expert, but a lot of people simply turn to the good old Special Air Service Survival Handbook by John Wiseman, and you'll actually find a lot of basic concepts of survival. Everything that you need to survive in a difficult situation. Here's the thing, though, with physical survival. Some people say that physical survival isn't worth it. If you ever watch any of those nuclear war films, you find that it's just not worth it to survive a full nuclear exchange. It's going to be awful. Didn't you watch Threads? It just got more awful with each passing year. The people got sicker, more people died, and civilization broke down. Yeah, maybe so. But it is interesting to think about that you don't even need a full level reset. Perhaps there's just some sort of collapse or calamity in the civilization that causes a breakdown. And maybe you need to actually have the ability to survive. Yes, Jamie, a lot of people have a copy. A lot of people have a copy because there are a lot of basic field crafts in here that are good to know. And, maybe you're just in a crash or you're in an isolated area and you just have to get back to civilization. Or you don't want to be on that I shouldn't be alive show, right? Or you do, and you want to say, yes, because I bought a copy of the SAS handbook, I know exactly how to survive. It is well written, and it does give you a lot of different techniques. So, there you go, Jamie. Need weed to survive. There you go. Unless you become a super mutant. Yeah, I don't want to be dipped in forced evolutionary virus, though, but that's just me. Maybe some people are good on it. But one of the films that you can look at, or a series of films that really depict a breakdown of civilization and do a very subtle and yet direct job of it, is the original Mad Max trilogy. In the first Mad Max film, titled Mad Max, you see the beginning of the breakdown of civilization. And even though they had a shoestring budget, barely any budget at all, it was amazing what George Miller and Byron Kennedy put up on screen. And Mad Max is considered one of the most successful independent films of all time, and it has one of the best ratios in terms of how it was received. But as these films went on, what you actually saw was how civilization broke down. And so it resulted in different means of survival. And what you saw in the Mad Max movies was having the ability to be adaptive and having the ability for mobility or being able to move from point A to point B. Suddenly, gas was a very sought after resource. Now, I know that the more recent Mad Max films, or if you want to call them the Furiosa films, that might be a more appropriate title. It doesn't matter. Mad Max in the 2000s, we'll just say that they seem to be a little bit more on a different fantasy perspective. They're still good films, but I like kind of the touchy grittiness of the original films a lot more. I thought they did a better job of really conveying this breakdown. It was subtle, but it was present. How people were fighting over fuel, how they were fighting over limited resources, and would it really come down to that? Would you really be this rugged individualist, or would there be survival in pockets? Or would there still be some sort of organized government or society at that time that would try to survive it? And then, of course, then there's that question, could you trust that organized remnant or that quote unquote enclave? I guess that's really a decision you may have to make at some point in time. And again, people always ask the question, well, is it worthwhile to survive or isn't it? Well, in the Mad Max trilogy, the original trilogy, what you ultimately have is someone who goes through this apocalyptic wasteland and finds their own humanity. That's why I think it was a great series of films. And here you have the full layout of Bartertown, the first settlement after the apocalypse or the nuclear exchange or the reset, whatever you want to think of it as, in the Mad Max films. Bartertown being a very interesting place and not being evil as much as it's showing the same difficulty with civilization. And a very, very intriguing character portrayed by Tina Turner, Auntie Entity. I miss the days with the old complicated characters with many different motivations. But really, in the original Mad Max films, all the characters were very, very interesting. Again, I'm not denigrating the current Mad Max films, they just have a different focus. I just remember growing up with these and watching them repeatedly many times. So, perhaps I'm emotionally biased. I'll admit it. But you go from that to this concept of maybe living off the grid. And you'll find there's many alternative researchers who promote living off the grid. And maybe there's a lot of good reasons to live off the grid. Of course, then, there's a little bit of a sacrifice if you live off the grid. You're dealing with a few more hardships. And maybe this is all it is. It's just a simple little wood house that you build in some remote area. And that's what it's all about, is living off the grid in some particular area. And that's how you're actually going to survive the reset. Or maybe it doesn't even have to be a reset, a little bit of a collapse in civilization at the time. So Mad Max became savage. Mad Max did become savage, Albie. And then Mad Max came back. It was a full loop of the story. Of course, again, I'm just talking about the original trilogy. Yeah, and the new films, I don't even think of it as Max Rockatansky. I just say it's a guy named Max. But who knows for sure? Nothing against Tom Hardy. He's a great actor, but that's the character that he plays. But you'll see this. There's lots of different examples of people living off the grid. And again, there's hardship that you accept. And believe me, just operating a farm, even on the grid, can be very difficult. So if you have experience working or living on a farm, you can get an idea for what living off the grid can really be. Winters become a lot harsher. If you've ever listened to John Levi talk about the winters that he goes through, he conveys it pretty well. Winters can be harsh. I mean, they're hard enough even when you have the modern conveniences of civilization to support you. When you're on your own, winters become very difficult, unless you're in some other location. But every particular area, whatever latitude you're at or whatever kind of environment, has its challenges. Sure, there's plenty of water and things to eat in the jungle, but my goodness, that heat and humidity, it'll take a toll on you just as fast as cold weather will. Now, you go from that to the other extreme where you have the concept of the dome cities, perhaps established by some sort of civilization or the remnant of it, and most prominently featured in the 1970s film Logan's Run, where you have an entire dome city where there's a limit on the population and there's rules that are imposed on how long you can live, up to 30. And once you hit 30, you go to carousel and, no one's going to be renewed. The computer tells Logan that. It's kind of funny, but sick at the same time, but funny the way it tells him, and he's just shocked no one's ever been renewed. But prior to that, the denizens of the city live a very hedonistic lifestyle. And it's very odd that there is no real civilization anymore. It's caught in a a stagnation loop. People are just living for hedonism. There's no self-reflection. There's no introspection. Very, very interesting if you can ever see the film Logan's Run. And yeah, I'll probably come back to cover it at some point in time when I do another old world in film. Got some very interesting responses on it, but that's where all these ideas are and where you come across them. Now, you can see that there's a lot of dystopian concepts with building these large cities or these isolated cities. And before you know it, you might even have the hive cities that we talked about. And the next thing you know, you got a hive city horror. So it's something you've got to be cautious on because before you know it, what do we got here from Michael? Do you think all the past science fiction writers really just made up their ideas on their own? I think they had a lot of inspiration. And certain people like Robert Heinlein and others, you really have to wonder where they were getting this inspiration from. I mean, the alternative is there was this brief period of creativity and they came up with all these concepts. Or maybe they actually had access to other works, much in the same way that we suspect that J.R. Tolkien may have. And Tolkien was probably a lot more direct in talking about where he got his inspirations from. We just don't know for sure. But you think about what we explored with the Hive City horror and how bad things could really get, where you have this population in this very cramped and confined area. And another science fiction writer who wrote about it was Frank Herbert, the guy who did Dune. He also did another novel called The Dosidai Experiment, or The Dosidai Experiment, depending on how you want to pronounce it, where you have a population that's confined in a very cramped urban area. Moving on from that concept for how a society and a civilization may survive spiritually, you can read the science fiction novel A Canticle for Leibowitz, which revolves around several resets. And in the novel, it's an example of a civilization rebuilding after multiple resets. Now, granted, it's limited to nuclear exchange, and that's what causes every reset, but the principles are all the same. And again, it comes down to any knowledge, anything being preserved by monasteries. And the idea is very interesting. Now, you're never going to see a real full film adaptation of this, although it did appear in the fourth season of Babylon 5, the final episode of the fourth season, The Deconstruction of Falling Stars. They gave an example of it after Earth endured a nuclear exchange. But many different interesting ideas, advanced architecture, ideas of civilization and technology being preserved by isolated groups of people living off the grid. And it's really the prominence of this story, A Canticle for Leibowitz. And then, of course, you have some artistic renderings of it, and you have the same concept of the isolated monastery where the remnants of civilization are preserved. And indeed, our mainstream history does corroborate that when we say that there are monasteries that likely saved civilization. And moving on past that idea, if you've ever seen the film In the Name of the Rose, and I know it was a more recent adaptation of the TV series, although I strongly recommend the 1980s film with Sean Connery and a slew of other incredible actors, you see exactly what this is, where you have these monks who just seem like they're living in an apocalyptic wasteland, but they're working in this incredibly built structure to preserve this knowledge. And there's something that feels, and yes, I'm using the word feels because I don't know for sure, but it feels very authentic. It feels like this really was something that happened, because how exactly do you explain these people who seem to be living in a lot of ignorance constructing a structure like this? And indeed, the monastery, the abbey, the compound that they're on, whatever you want to call it, it's very impressive. And indeed, the character of Sean Connery, Brother William, he's of the Franciscan order, and yet he values knowledge. Yet at the same time, he's also considered to be arrogant because of his knowledge. And he goes out of his way to try to save books from a burning library, a library that was in this particular tower that was also a labyrinth. And here, the abbey, you can actually see this entire compound. And even the author of the original The Name of the Rose is quite an interesting individual, graduate of the University of Bologna. And we covered it when we explored the libraries concept, because what if these were libraries that were overlapping and we actually saw this? And this is really the template that we have for how our civilization survived, for all we know. Yes, absolutely, Sherry. Umberto Eco. If I'm pronouncing that correct, and I'm probably not, because I always need to go back and switch gears when I'm pronouncing Italian. So anyway, Yes, it is a very interesting book. And another book by Umberto Eco I recommend is Foucault's Pendulum. Foucault's Pendulum. That's another very interesting one, especially when you tie it into recent events. Vaughn, Byzantines equals star forts, do you think? Mm, possibly. Maybe it's an even earlier time. But you look at this, and if you watch Name of the Rose, you do see how it sets out. Here's a sketch of the very complicated labyrinth where all the old books of lost knowledge were hidden in. But watch the film and view it with the old world eyes and tell me, does it make sense? Are we really seeing a monastery from the Middle Ages when knowledge was suppressed, or are we seeing something else? Therein lies the question. Now, oddly enough, you can go into certain libraries in places such as New York City, and you'll have very impressively well adorned reading rooms like this. Now, why in the heck do you need to have a reading room laid out like this? Yes, we can see our favorite cartouche in this. And you'll have, again, anomalies like this. Is it possible that these were other structures that were designated for survival? Very, very intriguing. And again, they could be in the cities. Maybe they weren't the largest cities or they weren't the cities that were being targeted at that time. Notice I'm not saying large shitties. I'm talking about cities here. So let's be clear on it. But very, very interesting when you go to a reading room like this and you pay attention to all the symbols and you consider this as a symbolism that you see everywhere. Oddly enough, it's the exact same symbols that we've seen in other various locations, such as, oh, I don't know, the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. This is in New York City, but you see the same symbols. Well, I guess everybody liked their little flower, their cartouche, their griffins. You don't get more American than that in the early 1900s. But that's really where it all boils down to with the survival concept, because you're talking about individual physical survival, you're talking about your civilization, your society surviving, your knowledge, but then you're also talking about a spiritual survival, because if you recall the nuclear nightmare fear films of the early 1980s, remember that in spirit, those people were completely broken in every single film. You died, your civilization was ended, and spiritually, you were broken. And so, if you think about it, perhaps that's the most important concept of surviving the reset, retaining that desire for the fire within. Could be wrong, but it's just a different way of looking at things. And of course, I couldn't help but include a little reference to classic Judge Dredd. And yes, I will admit I grew up reading Judge Dredd in the original comics. Oh, I miss those days. And the Sylvester Stallone film was okay, I guess. It was good to see Max von Sydow in it. But I will admit that was an example of a film from the 2000s that was a little bit better. The one with Carl Urban I thought was infinitely better. But that's just my opinion. Make of it what you will. But looking at Judge Dredd, the concept where you have cities, city states, Mega City 1, Texas City, Mega City 2, and everything else has just been waylaid or turned into a wasteland. Very interesting premise. And if you do find yourself in a reset situation, or you're on the run and facing the destruction of your civilization, do not listen to this guy, Lee Adama. This character is a character portrayed in the series who completely loses the desire for survival. And indeed, the series ends with the entire civilization deciding to destroy itself. Although maybe the writer just ran out of ideas. I don't know. Obviously, I'm not the biggest fan of reimagined Battlestar Galactica, but I always found it interesting that the way they handled a reset was basically just to give up and completely give up all their technology, their society, their civilization, and they were just going to end up on this planet, and that's how things ended. Yeah. Keep in mind, this is the same group of people that were mutinying and revolting over the slightest thing. But yes, you're going to give up your technology. You're going to live in hardship because we want a fresh start. Lee Adama said so let's do it. Yeah, I couldn't resist just throwing that out there. It's just interesting when you think about how they just decided to impose a reset on themselves. Well, actually, they imposed a societal destruction. Whenever I go back and I watch Battlestar Galactica and Adama says things like, our history will have to judge Kane. Oh, no, you won't have any history. You won't have anything. But then I realize, what if there's a parallel in that? Oh, anyway. Well, no, maybe I need to send a letter of congratulations to Ron Moore and tell him, he really got some good things in that series, but I don't think he was doing it intentionally. Just my opinion. And I got nothing against Ronald D. Moore. Okay, yeah, he destroyed the Klingons, but it's a discussion for another time. So let's go to our last part of this exploration, the wasteland. And I just want to look at some other images, and we have looked at plenty images of destroyed landscape. Indeed, we did in the last live stream. But what I wanted to get at beyond the destroyed cities is there's actually a more recent time frame that we have that we've overlooked quite a bit. We've talked about it in brief. Of course, we've seen the destroyed cities images quite extensively. We've seen the devastated land, but what we haven't seen is the Dust Bowl. And this was very recent, the Dust Bowl phenomenon that occurred in the United States in the mid 1930s. Again, part of that Great Depression. So while they were throwing up all these impressive Art Deco buildings, the very middle portion of the United States, we'll look at a map that was purported to be affected here in a second, was destroyed by this Dust Bowl, where you had entire buildings that were buried. Now, was that really from the 1930s? Or again, is that showing that perhaps we have other historical events that are overlapping? Don't know. But when you compare that to things such as the Peshtigo fire, you can't help but get certain similarities. And believe me, there's no shortage of what we have in documenting the Dust Bowl. So just these entire great dust storms that were descending on towns, this one in South Dakota, the Black Blizzard as they called it. Very interesting that this is so well documented. They had all these photographers that were just sitting all over the place to document this. Just like the Great Depression itself, where they caught pictures of people driving out west. But now you think about that and you remember the images that we looked at with the post-reset horror. What if they really are from the same time frame? What if this isn't actually a dust bowl, but some other event entirely? Perhaps the remnants of some previous reset that was still occurring, or some other disaster that we can't really explain that affected a very particular geographic area. And oddly enough, the areas of the Midwest being afflicted in this way, with dust and dirt all over the place. Suddenly it gives us a completely different explanation and understanding of what may have actually been going on. Yeah, there you go, Mark. It does kind of look like a nuke, doesn't it? And certainly from some of the footage, it's very, very strange. It's really hard to deconflict what's going on. Michael, LA really knows how to stir up a beehive. Oh, goodness. You're being far too kind to me. But you think about this concept of the wasteland, and like I said, there's no shortage of images that document how much dust there was all over the place and really show you this destruction, these farms and these towns and these areas just being destroyed. And is this really what was happening? You recall this earlier image that we had from Dubuque, Iowa, where we have the house and no trees anywhere. And here you can see the extent of the dust storm, 1930 to 1940. Now, it's not the entire Midwest. Oddly enough, it seems to be confined to certain states. Very, very strange. I mean, I guess there is a little bit of overlap, but really, really odd how it's all of Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, a little bit of Wyoming, Montana, and a little bit of North Dakota. But it didn't seem to touch Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, which is quite intriguing because even back then, that was the breadbasket of the United States. And when the United States got into World War II, there was much ado about the farmers being a strategic part of World War II. Many of them weren't drafted, believe it or not, even though they were trying to form the largest army the United States ever has and likely ever will field, according to official history. But who knows? And you can find odd paper clippings, this one from St. Paul Daily News, that talk to you about what this terrifying dust storm really was. Although when you read the details about it, there's some very interesting anomalies. There always seems to be. This one from 1936. But the whole Great Depression itself was an odd anomaly. And then when you look at some of these images of the wasteland, oddly enough, again, artwork from the Middle Ages, you see the same thing. An arid landscape covered in dust, totally destroyed and desiccated. Very, very fascinating. Very unique overlaps with what we have and what we've been told to expect. Lane, anyone who's been through a sandstorm knows they're actually muddy. Oh, yes. As soon as you get that little drop of water, suddenly it becomes a mudball storm. And in a way of saying, it can suddenly become hell on earth. Although I'm glad you mentioned that, Lane, because, they do have sandstorms over the Middle East all the time. And oddly enough, they're not apocalyptic. They're just basically a weather inconvenience. Yeah, they can really suck. Don't get me wrong. But, there are things that people survive and on they go. So it's very, very intriguing. Kathy, they've been trying to kill us off for thousands of years. Yeah, or at least controlling what's really going on. So it's very intriguing when you look at the different perspectives of it. And then, of course, that goes into our Great Depression, our Great Migration, where everybody who was caught in the Dust Bowl states, they had to walk their way to the magical land of California, which was the only place where there were jobs. Which is kind of interesting because we just saw that the rest of the Midwest wasn't hit. So why was never mind, don't ask. That's just where they were told to go. So, yeah, interesting look at the road here. But comparing and contrasting that and then looking at the Dust Bowl, and, again, you can see different areas where it was affected and how it extended to more states. It is very peculiar, especially with that Great Depression that was going on at that time. And now considering all these images that we have of the apocalypse, the wasteland, and so much more. Oh, thanks, Heidi. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Cassie, I was like a paved road with concrete missing. Oh, yeah. Very, very strange, too. And I think I'm going to have to do an exploration of our original highway system at some point because that's a very peculiar story as well, how that formed. MB, worst farming practices now in Midwest. Dead soil for sure. Yeah, very, very intriguing what happened with farmers in the Midwest, especially in the 1980s. All starting with the war in Afghanistan, interestingly enough. At least that's what official history will say. Yeah, that little embargo didn't do so hot for the farmers in the Midwest. Very, very interesting time frame. Of course, who knows what was really driving those reasons. So, anyway. But this is our final image of the exploration. And what are your thoughts? If you're really going to survive a reset, I would just say this: be adaptive, be flexible, always question things. Maybe there won't ever be a reset in 1,000 lifetimes after us. We don't know. Or it could happen in 5 seconds. Or maybe the very nature of resets, as we've discussed before, is very different than we understand. But I think the real matter is it's the same rules that apply no matter what. If you want to live by rules, and you know what, you don't have to live by rules. You can live by your own devotions and your own desires. Guess what? You have the ability to do that. But be flexible, be prepared, and as always, do not follow the false prophets, whoever they may be. And I'm not talking about individuals. You might have to watch out for institutions. Now, of course, I'm not talking about institutions now, but maybe in the future they could be more corrupted. And that's something we should watch out for. Anyway, well, I hope you all enjoyed this exploration. I've got something very interesting in mind, though, for next week's exploration, but I'm not going to share it just yet. I've got a different way I'm going to try building this one up. And we've got a full week of explorations ahead, but appreciate all of you joining us. And before you go, because we didn't take a break, please hit that like button and support the channel. I really appreciate it. I appreciate everyone being here and contributing your ideas. And it does look like the channel Reddit page has been fully restored, so feel free to visit that. I will get it added to the links and probably put out a community announcement on the YouTube page about it, so you can go over there and take a look. So, anyway, I hope you all enjoy your weekend, and remember, don't ever give in to fear. I don't have any inclination in terms of the cycle or the timeline. There are plenty of people out there that will tell you they do, and maybe they do, but I'm just not seeing anything that looks any different than what we've already seen. But you never know. So, anyway, everyone have a great week. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you soon. This is Lucius Aurelian signing off.